Hey all, just wanted to check in with a couple of quick comments here for your short assignment, which is due next week. Um, it's the middle of fall break. It's a beautiful day outside. I should be outside. You should be outside. You should be having a good walk today. But some of you will be working on your essays, and some of you have been writing to me this week with questions and suggestions and asking me to maybe bouncing ideas off me and so on. And I just want to comment on one thing that I'm hearing a fair bit. Most of you are nicely moving away from describing the content of the article and getting toward the point of view or the argument of the piece that you're reading, and that's been really good. But I want to push you a little bit further and get you to think about authors, about who is writing this material. And in some cases, that means paying attention to who the person is, but you don't really need to do that in this course. Maybe in a more advanced course, you might want to think about that sort of thing. Certainly, if you go to grad school and you're doing this sort of thing, you should think about who the author is and what they're all about, what kind of work they do, and so on. But here I just want you to get at the arguments, and I just want you to think about the fact that human beings tell stories, and history is telling stories, and history is humans trying to understand the past in a particular way. I want to make a point that will seem in some ways kind of obvious to you, but in other ways it's pretty subtle and pretty important as well. This is, I'm holding your textbook here, the Visions textbook. And I want to make the point that this is not history. This is a book. This is paper with words on it. And the words were crafted by human beings. Now, they were done by professional academic historians, well, in most cases anyhow, with careful research. They looked at primary source evidence to try to tell their story in a particular fashion. But it really matters, first off, what evidence they looked at. So different historians look at different pieces of evidence and arrive at different conclusions. This week, for example, in our American Revolution Week, Gordon Stewart and George Rollock looked at the papers and surrounding documents around a group of evangelical preachers in Nova Scotia at the time of the American Revolution. And they saw people who were concerned more about their souls than they were about the revolution. And so part of their interpretation is that religious evangelical fervor takes up the revolutionary spot in their hearts rather than politics. And so that's what explains why Nova Scotia didn't join the American Revolution. Who else? John Reed, for example, sees Indigenous people as continuing to pose a potential military threat to settlers in Nova Scotia because there's really not that many British settlers. Remember, this is after the expulsion of the Acadians. Not many British settlers there. So they're still concerned about Indigenous people tipping the balance of power. So he looks at that, and he's not looking at a preacher's papers. He's looking at colonial office papers relating to Indigenous affairs. He's looking at attempts on the part of the British to negotiate peace treaties with Indigenous peoples and so on, and correspondence from people in the countryside writing into the capital saying, where's our protection against these Indigenous people? They seem to still be a threat to us. They probably really weren't, but certainly they didn't know that at the time, and 20 years earlier they had been. So there's kind of that's what drives their thinking. So different pieces of evidence driving different conclusions. And I want to be clear, it's not like George Rollock says, oh, Indigenous people had nothing to do with it, it's all about religion. And I don't think John Reed is saying, oh, and religion has nothing to do with it, it's all about Indigenous people. What they're doing is contributing dimensions to a story. So it's not incumbent upon us to say, oh, that's the best answer. That doesn't really matter. I just want you to see that there are different possible answers. And I want you to see that human beings construct these things. So really what I'm just driving at here, it's a pretty simple point, is that I want you to talk about the authors of these pieces. I want you to say, John Reed argues that, and go. I want you to say that Gordon Stewart and George Rollock argue that other thing. I want you to be able to explain that in some sort of useful fashion to me. And that's really kind of the critical point here. I want you to see that people see different dimensions of the story, and I want you to see that it's not just that this is the way it happened, the way the historian tells you the story, but that the way we tell the story, the evidence we look at, gives us different impressions and different ideas on how to think about the past. It's absolutely clear to us, and I can't make this point strongly enough. Again, I'll grab my prop here, the book here, and I'll say, this is not history. This is just a book. It's just words on paper. Humans put the word on paper, and that's what we do here. So that's not the truth. It's not what happened. It's us trying to figure out what happened. It's come as close as we can to figuring all this stuff out. And that's why these additional perspectives are really interesting, because it means that when we're telling a story, we tell a story in a particular fashion. And then suddenly we look at different evidence, we go, oh, we can tell a story this way. And it's not just interesting that we can tell the story in a different way, although that is kind of interesting. But it's also interesting for us as human beings to think, oh, it's a complex world and we need to think about it in different ways. And so, when I think about you people as students moving on to be citizens and active participants in the politics of the world, I want you to also keep these kind of basic lessons in mind, that the world operates this way in this kind of complex fashion. So this is not just an academic exercise. It's an academic exercise, but it's not just one. I want you to think about people and how they think about history. It's really, really important. So think about that when you're writing your essays. I've got this lovely little picture here, and it's a nice little illustration, I think, of a different dimension of what we're talking about. This is a totally unfamous battle. It's known to us. Well, there's some records attached to it, but not much more. A small battle takes place near the end of the 7 Years' War on the St. Lawrence River, approximately near where Cornwall is today. It's a tiny battle. It's 2 ships. Well, it's actually 5 ships, but there's 4 small British ships, very small ones, basically river trading vessels that had a couple of guns on them, and a French larger frigate is trying to go up the river. It's an actual warship, and the 4 small vessels attack it. And because they're able to maneuver around it, they're successful. And this, it's a small little story in the war. It doesn't change the course of the war or anything like that. It's not like the battles of the Plains of Abraham or Louisburg or something like that. It's a relatively small little event. But it's an interesting picture, and it's an interesting picture for us as historians to look back and see this thing. But of course, what I want you to run with this analogy that I want you to think a little bit about, this is not the truth. This is not the facts of the story. It's a painter, Thomas Davies. He's a British military officer. He's on the scene, and he records the events. He records the events 2 years after the events. He records the events from his memory, and he shows different details of this. And he was, at this place. He was at this fort on the St. Lawrence River. He was there in 1760. He knows there was indigenous people there. He paints them into the landscape. I guess he saw there were sunflowers there too. There's some interesting details to this picture. But he's trying to record an event. I don't want you to think that this is making up history. This is not what's going on here. But it's still being done from memory. And he's trying to give as accurate a picture as possible. He's only able to do so much because memory only offers us so much, and there's no real documentation, and we don't know exactly what happened. Maybe one of those boats sunk. Maybe it wasn't as spectacular a battle as we thought. Maybe the French boat didn't even have any guns on board. We have no idea. I'm kind of making this up now at this point, but I do want you to think that there's an element of storytelling in this picture, and trying to convince the audience of a particular way that it happened and might be interesting to them. This is fairly banal, but I want to just quickly move on to another picture, which is significantly more political in its presentation of a story, and therefore really trying to convince you of something. But again, I want to remind you of the human dimension involved in storytelling, which is in some ways just like history. This is John Shetke, not a famous painter at all. He's a British military painter, middle third of the 19th century. And this is actually one of his more famous works. It's a celebrated moment from the War of 1812 when HMS Shannon, a British warship, captured off the coast of New England an American frigate, the Chesapeake, and then hauled it, towed it, led it, as the painting title here says, back to Halifax in disgrace. And of course, the disgrace is really obvious because see the flags in the background, the British flag above the American flag, showing that they've captured, that they've taken possession of this. This is now the leading flag of this vessel. That's meant to be illustrating the humiliation of the British in this moment, the humiliation of the Americans in this moment, that Britain captured the prized warship of the American fleet. And you can see Halifax, you may not recognize it as Halifax, but it's Halifax on the left. You can see a British flag, and there's the citadel in the background. There's a couple of little illustrations that, if you know Halifax at all, you might vaguely recognize. It is 200 years later, but anyhow, you might get the general idea. What I want to get at here, though, is that this is propaganda. This is clearly propaganda. This is meant to tell the story in a very particular way. Look at those flags. the most prominent and best lit feature of this painting is the flags, because that's the whole point of this picture. It's not to show you an accurate picture of the Halifax waterfront. In fact, it's probably not an accurate picture of the Halifax waterfront, because John Shetke had never been to Halifax. He has no idea really exactly what it looks like. He had probably seen some general sketches in some other places that he used as a kind of model for this, but he had never been there. He certainly didn't see the scene. In fact, if you look at the reference that you're looking at here, the painting is done in 1830. What is that, 14 years, no more, 16 years after the actual battle. So he wasn't there. He didn't see it. But he's painting this, and he's trying to paint it for political purposes. But I want you to see that while it's propaganda, it's still an artist, or a storyteller, if you will, trying to tell a story in a particular fashion. But in the same way that when we apply our critical faculties to a text, when we look at, is the evidence convincing, does it provide a support for the argument that the author is making, we can kind of do the same thing here. We can look at this, we can recognize that there's a bias going on here. We can recognize that the story is being told in a particular way. You can do that with history too. We can look at it and we can see it through the eyes of the maker of the story, the person telling the story, and the evidence they use. I'm not trying to engage in any kind of, there's two versions of every story kind of nonsense. What we're all about in history is finding good evidence to prove our stories. This is key to everything we do. We're not just making stuff up. This is not conspiracy theory nonsense. This is not fake news or anything like that. There's a real disciplined approach to try to tell the story as well as possible. But we're still limited in what we can do. We can only look at so much evidence. We can only look at the story through our own experiences and our own biases. And we can try to filter that out all we want, but we're still going to tell stories in particular ways depending on what we look at and depending on how we think about it. I want you to think about that a little bit as you write your essays. I want you to foreground your authors. I want you to tell me, this author says that author says this other thing. Show me how the authors are constructing their arguments, the points that they're making, and how their evidence supports that. That's what we're doing throughout this course. And in this little short assignment that we're doing in October, next week, I really want you to get at a really quick and distilled version of that. We're going to do a longer version later. In this version, I don't want you to do footnotes, no apparatus, academic or apparatus or anything. Just 2 pages. Tell me what's going on in these excerpts. Tell me what the arguments that they're making. Make some quick comments on the evidence that they're using. Try to convince me that you understand the different viewpoints that are at work here. And that's pretty much what it's about. I want you to think about history as a human creation, not as something that we can know for certain. We can't know it for certain. It's gone. We just have these traces of the past, the evidence to help us understand it. It's the best we've got, and we work with it, and we work with it honestly to the best of our abilities, but it's still all we have. I hope you guys are taking a little bit of time to catch your breath over the break. I know a lot of you are working, trying to get some essays done, trying to catch up, all kinds of good things happening there. That's wonderful. But catching your breath is important too. This is a hard term. We've been talking in my 4th year class about how hard it is to do all this online stuff when you've got 5 classes. I'm doing 2 classes, and it's exhausting for me to be spending all this friggin' time in screen world. So you guys doing 5, it's hard. I get it, it's hard. And I want you to know that you can talk to me. Not about your personal stuff, but you can talk to me about your academic difficulties. We can talk about things. We can negotiate some things. We can accommodate some things. We can work on some things. Or I can send you off to people who might be able to help you. There is really great support around the university. I do understand that, I want you to understand that I understand that it's tough right now, and we'll get through this. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but we're all working hard and we're all trying and we're all doing our best. Enjoy the rest of your breaks. Take care. Talk soon.